Last week, we re released one of our most popular episodes by far, How Trauma Lives in the Body and Why Heal Your Nervous System. And it's been a couple years since we recorded that. And, science changes and most importantly, we change, right? Our perspective broadens and deepens. So today we're going to re record on this topic, really diving into the science of how trauma lives in the body, the role of applied neurology in healing, and looking at complex trauma as well as an attachment wound, and to explore the role of relational healing and collective change, which is something we've focused on so much in the past few seasons. So I'm really excited to dive back into this conversation. Welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co-host, Elisabeth Christoph, founder of brainbase.com, an online community where we use applied neurology, somatics, and emotional processing for behavior change and resilience. And I'm also the founder of the Neuro-somatic Intelligence Coaching Certification Program, ICF accredited course that helps therapists and practitioners bridge the gap from the body to the brain.
And I'm your co-host, Jennifer Wallace, a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide. And I help women prepare their bodies and nervous systems for psychedelic experiences and big peak somatic experiences for a deeper healing process. And I bring neurosomatic intelligence into that journey when we work together. And I'm also one of the educators for the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification.
So we know that on here, when we're talking about trauma, it's a little bit more than just trauma living in the tissues, right? It's really about the way the brain and the nervous system are patterned by a big stressor or by chronic stress. And we've talked a lot about how trauma isn't just the event itself. It's the protective, adaptive response of the nervous system that is aimed always first and foremost at keeping us alive. It's this recurring reaction within the body and the nervous system in response to the threats that we face, whether those are real or perceived. And with this shift, we really stop seeing behaviors or outputs as the problem to be fixed and start seeing them as signs of the nervous system doing the best that it can to protect and adapt. And in that way, when we're talking about trauma, we're really talking about something that lives in the now, right? Not a past event. It's the ongoing dysregulation of the nervous system that occurs repeatedly after those difficult events or series of events. And it's the changes that happen in our brain and our nervous system. It's how we have adapted, and then how those adaptations continue to create our reactions in the present moment. These implicit memories in the body, the sensations, the signals, the impulses that then influence our behavior and our thoughts and the way we connect with other people. And it's also trauma is what disconnects us from those signals as well, right? Chronic dissociation, numbness, the inability to be embodied. And so we're going to really look today at how those patterns get created and what we can start to do to begin to repattern in a really practical way that also includes connecting with others and the relational components of healing.
I was thinking about this examples to give for this. And every time I got into an example, it always led me to an emotional component and how so much of like the danger that we perceive isn't the same danger that our brain can really reconcile, right? And then what really is at the foundation of connecting this is the emotional tag that runs through to connect the primitive to the modern. And that, you know, relationally, how when I think about the ACE scores that I have, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, and separation and divorce of my unit. And Elisabeth and I have said many times in our private conversations, like had I had a very attuned family to go home to that connected to me very deeply, so much of the other A scores wouldn't even matter or would not hold the weight that they do. Not that they wouldn't matter. I'm sure there would still be imprints, but it's this emotional undercurrent of shame and doubt and fear and anger and sadness that one would start to develop when you have emotion, when you experience emotional neglect, and any of the ACE scores. And then I started looking at how the sexual abuse patterned a freeze response in my body. It patterned, I always knew this. This always makes sense, right? I have sexual abuse from a non-familiar member. I freeze. I want to fight. I can't fight, so I freeze, stay frozen over those years. Shame, shameflammation leads to illness. Very clear understanding of that path. But I also have seen in a very recent experience how emotional neglect causes that same freeze response. It's so well worn, and there's no telling which one came first. So it's the same either way. There's a freeze response. There is a anger response because I'm angry. I want that connection. I want that love. I want that attachment. I want all of those things. And it angers me that there would be discord or separation in any way. And then that comes out in all of the attachments, right? All of my relationships, right? Where you want your specific needs to be met and you play out these same patterns relationally. But then in that freeze, I really feel the tension, the bracing, the shameflammation. And then it feels like, well, of course there was illness at some point, the high level of stress that I'd been under from such a tiny body up until my whole body that I lived in up until 37, right? So it all makes sense. So then cancer. And now, even though I had insane, beautiful results in that cancer experience, on the back end, I'm discovering some autoimmunity kind of things, right? We just had that conversation about how that often appears so much later in a woman's life as we get on these journeys and go on.
Yeah, I
I don't know
think
if I am or not.
those are some really important, big, deep understandings of how these events happen, and then later the results that show up in the body, the disease, the autoimmune, um, the recurring reactions that then lead over time to those outputs. And I also want to give like a real in the moment example for people of what this might feel like in their body, because it occurs like big picture, long term over time. And then it's also in these little moments if I just feel that reaction in my body. And, there was a time when we were navigating some boundary stuff with the podcast, had to make some decisions about, we had to put some boundaries in place. And I was reading an email from someone, and of course, I know I'm safe and I'm an adult and I can handle a situation. And immediately, boom, like my heart is like pounding out of my chest. I feel all the saliva go out of my mouth. And then, like, I'm trembling, I'm shaking. And before you know it, I'm like laying on the floor, my joints are swollen, things are puffy, and I'm having this huge reaction to a boundary that's not really that significant to my life, but it taps in. There are many things about that situation that tapped into an implicit memory in my body of other big boundary violations. And so my body is reacting with the inflammation, with the tension, with the bracing, with the panic. And in that moment, that trauma is present for me in my life. And that starts to shape my behavior, maybe wanting to go into some of those maladaptive behaviors, or maybe wanting to shut down and pull back or run out of the situation. It starts to shape my thoughts. I have those recurring narratives that go along with shame and panic. And so everything shifts into that new reality. And I really have to lean into my relationship with you, to be supported by others, to use my neuro tools so that I can work through some of that and then have a different reaction and not just be repressing it, but also not move into the behaviors that I don't want, because I want to be able to show up in my life and manage a business like an adult woman.
I'm trying to think of how I really want to phrase something, because when I reflect on both of our journeys and how far we've come with what does live in our bodies and the consistent commitment to knowing that, like, the trust in the relationship between us and the relationship of the people that we have around us, that inherent there's an inherent trust, and trust brings safety. So even when our nervous systems are really heightened, there is a co-regulator nearby, or someone to reflect kind of the truth, the actual reality, not the perceived threat reality. So I find like having community is like, the more we've gone through this over the years and the more our community has grown, that's a really big reflection that I see, is that, like, wow, being around other women and just being able to hold these spaces for women and learning more and just being in it more and longer really makes me understand how much we need each other, and how important it is to find someone that you can work with and be with. Something else that's kind of coming up for me too is that there's a presence that exists now within me that was not there 2 years ago. Like, there's just more of me, a fuller version of me that walks this world. And that's back to that daily commitment and just knowing that, like, there is something, it just keeps getting better, even though I can feel more. And sometimes that feels very scary. And I have to have bigger conversations now. And I have to be more honest about things now. And that I actually can be more honest. That's very safe. And so the more life expands, there's like a bigger calling, but you also get fuller in your body. And that's just something that is really so beautiful, even when it's so scary, that I always want to move towards this.
I really was feeling that same thing as you were talking and as I was giving that example too. And I think it's important. I want to say, like, there was a long time in my life where I couldn't have felt that any of that was going on. Like, when I read that email, there's been a big journey to presence and embodiment that allowed me to have that experience and know, like, this is all happening in my body. It was happening all my life, all the time. I just wasn't aware of it. And so I would just keep going, pushing through or running away from things or shutting down or whatever. And all this stuff was happening in my body. And there wasn't the capacity to feel that stuff without moving into dissociation. And there wasn't the capacity to mobilize and express and re regulate. And so, even though that experience was like, it was an intense experience to be there and feel it, it's also, I'm giving my system new repetitions, new experiences with those old trauma patterns of being able to feel the sensations, mobilize, respond differently, and then the trust and the relationships there that you were talking about. Like, before working with my nervous system, before understanding complex trauma, I didn't have the capacity for presence to feel those things, to be embodied, and I didn't have the capacity to trust, right? To trust others, to get support, to build relationships where I was really self expressed and could be seen and heard and held authentically. And so that has been a huge difference, because we know that trauma brings us into that lens of hypervigilance where we're protecting ourselves first and foremost against all of that connection that we also need for our healing. And I think too, one of the things that I wanted to touch on about, what's been different for me since that earlier recording, just in terms of understanding too, is a kind of deeper, more nuanced understanding of dysregulation, and that it's not just this switch flipping into survival mode and a full F response, that there's this whole spectrum going on, and that our behaviors and our emotional experience is really more like a network reaction, a bunch of neurons that fire together and wire together, not going to necessarily go into like a full on fight response or flight response, but it might be more of an emotional flashback, right? There's shifts in my thoughts. There are shifts in my autonomic nervous system. There's shifts in the emotional experience, and all these parts of my brain and my body and my nervous system are working together, right? It's not just my limbic system or just my brain stem, but that there's a connection between the two, and it can distort my thinking. And yeah, just seeing more of a connection between the different brain areas, and understanding that the emotions, they're not just hardwired, and it's not just one emotion, but they're constructed from a combination of the external stimulus, the internal processes based on past experience, my conceptual frameworks, my body sensations. And when it comes to trauma, that framework, I think, under, helps us to understand a little bit more about how trauma lives in the body, because our brain is constructing the experience of trauma based on the way it's interpreting sensory information, because of the way that it's patterned and programmed from our past. And so, yeah, I've been thinking a lot more about neuro-tags and emotional flashbacks and all of that, and understanding our reactions, and that they're not so compartmentalized.
I love that we're having this conversation about these nuances because it's not just, oh, oh, boom, I'm in fight. Like there's a spectrum that we ride because we have neurotags, and survival neurotags are timeless. And all it has to go on to activate or not is through sensory inputs, receiving, and pattern recognition, right? And neurotags are like webs, and they have a physical component, a cognitive component, and an emotional component. And um, they are basically in those three activations, all 9 areas of our brain get activated and lit up through these neurotags. And they are unique to everyone. And they're basically a neurological representation of the world around us. They contain a whole bunch of general information about in them. And they really act as triggers to initiate survival actions or behaviors. And like I said, survival neurotags are timeless. So even though, like the examples that we've given here today, these tags get activated, even though it's something that happened many, 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 many decades ago for us. And then here it shows up in a present day email, in a present day diagnosis, in a grief loss situation. Like these tags get activated because all we have to do is experience one component of this web, and the whole thing gets brought up. And so what could activate a neurotag? It could be an acute trigger through one of the sensory inputs that are perceived as that are perceived as threatening by the amygdala and the limbic system. It could be visual, auditory, a smell, a taste, a touch, a tactile sensation. It could be the way that somebody looks at you, an animal, a loud noise, a particular sound, or a smell in the environment. And then also for that neurotag response, it needs to have pattern recognition, right, of the environment. So maybe that's language. The language someone in front of you is using, the tone of their voice. Maybe it sounds like someone who was abusive to you in your past, or maybe it was someone who was dangerous in your past. If people do certain things or act in certain ways, there's a background noise that happens, and it becomes, maybe it's quiet. Maybe it's the presence of a person or an object. Maybe it's a quiet noise. And so we've had conversations on here about beliefs, because beliefs are neurotags. The way that we believe ourselves to be in this world, or the way that we're perceiving the relationships around us, those are also part of our neurotags. And so there's an internal aspect of these neurotags, as these activation patterns in the brain that affect what's going on in the brain, also survive as also act as outputs to other thoughts and emotions. And so then the output of the neurotag is like the fear, the anxiety, the shutdown, depression, pain, fatigue, or engaging in behaviors. And so um, your brain, we're always seeking that expectation, right? And these neurotags, they grow as they are used. So just like neurons fire together and wire together, the neurotag in these firings, these connections, they grow larger as they are used. I think a really important thing to know is that these beliefs and neurotags are filters for the brain.
Yes, it impacts how we perceive all the other stimulus coming in, right? When we reach that activation threshold and that neurotag is pulled to the surface, it impacts how we're processing sensory information from all of our other different systems. And so we really are catapulted into different realities depending on which neurotag is activated. And I've been reading a lot of Lisa Feldman Barrett and constructed theory of emotion, and she talks about neurotags. She doesn't call them neurotags, but she talks about the brain more as like an airport with different hubs, and there's communication going between different areas all of the time. And I think that is a much better explanation of what's happening in these responses rather than just, oh, my frontal lobe is shut off and now I'm just being driven by my brainstem. Yes, my brainstem is having an impact on my autonomic nervous system and I'm moving into changes in my heart rate or my breathing, but there's also changes in my cognitive thoughts. It's not like my frontal lobe is completely offline. I'm still having thoughts and I'm still having an emotional reaction. All of these things are working together and they all become part of this response that is, again, really based on our past experience. And it's a pattern of activation that can then be repatterned through sensory stimulus, through new relational experiences, through movement, through all these different ways that we can start to give our brain and our nervous system and our body new experiences with those same things that would activate the neurotag.
Because we're in this window of tolerance, right? We have a window of tolerance before we're in this full blown response. And if you can already have enough regulation practice to be able to get above it enough to recognize it, you're going to save yourself from going into a full blown response. Like that's what I'm really hearing
Mm-hmm.
from you as we talk about this spectrum, is like a window of tolerance. Because in those moments we can do our drills, we can use our tools and turn this around.
Yes. Yeah. And in NSI, we talk a lot about the amygdala and this, that there's actually 7 different levels of amygdala activation. And so I might be moving toward more of that big reaction, but there's space in between. Like I'm completely calm and I'm in a full blown F response. And understanding that helps us to be able to start to repattern and broaden that window of tolerance and start to create new reactions. And then I think also, we talked a lot in the episode that was released last week about applied neurology and what that really means in terms of trauma resolution. But I do want to highlight a couple things here just to keep connecting those dots for people that, if we're talking about healing trauma through the lens of NSI, that's going to mean recognizing that emotions and then by extension our trauma responses that we're experiencing aren't fixed, right? Our brain is predictive first and foremost. We're always running on that pattern recognition, but that can be changed by introducing new experiences that change the old patterns. And when we have these different neurosomatic practices, we can start to interrupt the chronic predictions those loops that get activated and allow the nervous system to learn what safety might feel like in relationship, right? We can use sensory tools, training our brain to interpret different sensations differently, especially our interoceptive signals, the signals and sensations that come from within our body, working on the vagus nerve, or doing proprioceptive drills to help us know where our body is in space and decrease our stress load. There's cognitive components to that, engaging in practices where we can start to shift our narrative a little bit around our past trauma. Even just understanding how our brain and our nervous system work help us to start to see that differently and then start to create new predictive patterns. And then a lot of gradual exposure, minimum effective dose exposure to these things that might have elicited a big response, but working with that to again give ourselves the tools for regulation and to create safety in those environments, in new relationships, in new experiences, so that I'm rehabilitating those skills and allowing myself to not be so overwhelmed in that moment.
Yeah, because the brain is predictive in nature. It is constantly making predictions based on incoming sensory data from the body and from the environment. So it's reading that from our internal cues by how we're perceiving. And when trauma occurs, the brain starts predicting danger, even in situations that might not be threatening. So, this chronic threat detection, it keeps the nervous system in a constant state of dysregulation. By retraining the brain to make different predictions, we can shift from trauma based responses to more adaptive, healthy responses. And so, if you take, for example, sensory input drills like visual or proprioceptive exercises. These help the brain by beginning These help the brain become more accurate in interpreting sensory data. So, by improving the accuracy of the brain's sensory motor predictions, individuals can retrain their nervous systems to interpret their environments as safe rather than dangerous. And this is reducing trauma based responses. And so, what we look for to create a daily practice of is our high payoff drills, where we know after we reassess that we get that okay from the brain that it likes the stimulus that we get it. We get the thumbs up from the brain that it likes the information that we're providing it. And so we use high payoff drills, and these are the tool. I guess wasn't reading. These are tools that produce immediate observable changes in the body's performance or state of regulation. And these drills become part of a feedback loop that lets the individual know which practices are having the most beneficial effect on their nervous systems at any given time. And then we create a daily practice from that. And so high payoff tools could include respiration exercises like straw breathing or long exhales, could be vagus nerve stimulation, which can quickly help regulate, downregulate, and activate a nervous system that's in a fight or flight mode. Other neurosomatic tools like cranial nerve drills, like eye movement exercises or vestibular training, these help re-regulate the nervous system in moments of overwhelm. By identifying which tools provide immediate relief, individuals re-educate the nervous system in the skill of modulation, which is a skill that we want to have the appropriate response to a situation, to have that modulation in the nervous system. And that also helps us to increase presence. So what we do is we assess and we reassess. This involves evaluating the body's responses to various inputs and using that feedback to guide which practices should be continued or adjusted. In the context of trauma healing, this concept ensures that individuals are continually checking in with their nervous systems to ensure that the practices that they are using are beneficial rather than overwhelming or re-traumatizing.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. Assess and reassess and really start to learn how to communicate with your own nervous system. And what is really underneath, like the most important, to me, foundational principle of applied neurology is neuroplasticity, right? Understanding that our brain is plastic, meaning that it can change and adapt throughout our life. And that is really important to think about with trauma resolution, because with trauma, we can get stuck in these maladaptive patterns, hypervigilance, chronic stress, emotional dysregulation, chronic dissociation. And if we can start to understand how the brain is creating these patterns, and then we have some tools that can allow us to consciously engage in practices that are going to create new neural pathways. And so we want to leverage the power of neuroplasticity to teach our brain and our body new responses to stress, to perceived danger. And so, there's just this really brilliant part of applied neurology that I feel really grateful to have learned about, to bring into this space, because there's so much hope in that. And it's quite effective in creating a very tangible change. And then one of the things that we wanted to make sure to talk about in this episode, as we were listening and reviewing the other one, was the the link that we have seen between complex trauma and attachment wounds, and really exploring that, because all of season 3 was devoted to relational healing and exploring that impact. And the more we have the more we've really dove in to this, the clearer it is that trauma, even when you look at all of the ACE scores, it's experienced in a relational context with family, with caregivers, with society at large. That it's that wound that really disrupts our ability to form secure attachments. And then that is impacting our nervous system all of the time, because we are relational beings where our systems are wired to be in connection with one another. They're always communicating to one another. And what is the reaction that happens in my body as I move through the world and have relationships with other people? And we need co-regulation for for having a safer experience in our body, to be embodied, to process emotions. And there's so much chaos that can happen internally when we're seeking that safety and connection, and at the same time it's really threatening. And so, even in the episode with Anna that we did recently on autoimmune, we could see a lot of times the biggest flare-ups of our autoimmune reactions were in times of relational stress. That is such a big stress to the body and the nervous system that can activate a lot of these patterns.
I see it. I see it in the emotional neglect. If you have heard me say this before if you listen to this podcast, but if you have a relationship with your parents, your primaries, the people who raised you, and you experienced emotional neglect as an ACE score, that never changes. It's that is the ongoing living ACE score. And so to try to find resolution for that in your body is a great feat. I am finding, as it is my work and has always been my work, although not knowing it. It's always comes down to the attachment, because that attachment is very important to me. I want it also. And so it's almost a form of self-abuse in a way. It's almost masochistic. But
But it's
seriously,
also
it's
true, right? I
it's
mean, there's
true.
so much
It
truth in what
hurts.
you just said, that we cannot stop ourselves from continuing to seek that connection, because it is a deep need. It's a deep need. And sometimes that need is it's a need that we have with someone that might not have the capacity, and that has not had the tools or taken this journey of exploration into working with their own body, the emotional maturity and intelligence to be able to handle that. And then it's like, sometimes it starts to feel like Charlie Brown with the football, like I'm running to kick it and it's going to get pulled away. And there's this balance between, honestly, I don't know. Some of it has to do with finding safety inside of ourselves, cultivating new relationships, allowing ourselves to be able to accept someone where they're at, and then also just allowing ourselves some grace and understanding that, like, yeah, I do want this. And it's human to want that connection. And how do I repattern so that the reaction inside isn't so big when I maybe don't get that connection, because that might not happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, relational healing is essential because trauma disrupts the brain's ability to process the ability to respond to social signals. And the isolation, as we know, we've talked about it so much, is dangerous and dangerous for the body. And the parts of the brain that are responsible for social connection are heavily impacted by trauma. Rebuilding neural pathways requires engagement and safe relational experiences where individuals can learn to trust, feel seen, feel heard, feel connected. And then through those safe relationships, the brain learns to interpret social signals differently. And then over time, fosters a greater sense of belonging and relational safety.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about that some in our episode with Luis too, about just the power of being witnessed and having those safe relationships. And I do think it is a really huge component to that, where that is really truly where I've built a lot of trust, is in these other spaces and allowing myself to be vulnerable in that. And then it does change also too how I interpret the world around me, right? If I'm in this other lens, somebody's tone of voice or the look on their face or their posture, I can have a very different reaction to that when I'm in an emotional flashback or in a pattern trauma response, where I'm really reading that stuff very differently from what their intention might be, from what the present moment really is. And so as I start to create more presence and regulation and safety in myself, I can have a little bit more space to take in this other information about another person, to know maybe something isn't about me, to not have it create that giant reaction inside of my body. And so it really does change also to how I see the world, how I interact with other people.
For sure. For sure. And it takes time. It really takes time to repattern the predictive response. It takes time to repattern a belief. It takes time to just understand the emotional component when something is you know to flush repressed emotions, to start to, it's not even about releasing emotions, it's about having the capacity to feel the emotions that are coming from your body, the sensations that are coming from your body. So it's never like, yes, we talk about things as like purge, flush, move, and all of that happens in the capacity that you build within your nervous system and in your body, right? That's how we begin to feel that. So it's it it just does take time. I just want to stress that for people. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, I've been how long is this going to take?" or whatever. It's like it's kind of once you decide to make an intentional commitment, you just kind of make an intentional commitment, you start walking a path. And it takes the time that it takes for your nervous system to shift.
100%. And I always want to keep it real with people too. Like, there's not, I don't have the experience of not living in a body that still sometimes is very reactive to things. It's just a matter of, now I have the capacity to feel and honor that reaction, to be with it, to move through. And that took a while too. Just like you were saying, it's not like a one and done, not every emotional experience is the same. It depends on the relationship that I'm in. It depends on the context of that for my life. And so there's just a lot of different situations and different ways that it unfolds. And I think there's a big component too that we've had the honor and the privilege of getting to speak to some really amazing somatic practitioners and have a lot of conversations about also the collective component of nervous system healing, and that beyond just like the relationship with our family, there is also the big picture society that we are swimming in, right? That is also impacting our nervous system, and we are inherently social creatures. Our nervous systems are wired for connection, and the trauma that we experience is not solely an individual experience, right? There's a systemic component to that as well. And there's lots of different types of experience with that. There's racial trauma, systemic oppression, intergenerational trauma, um, gender issues, hustle culture, chronic stress, all of these things, financial stressors that are experienced collectively by entire communities. And healing in isolation from these broader contexts, then we're only really looking at a part of the issue. And to start to broaden that out a little, there's a collective dimension to healing too. And healing in collective spaces also gives us the opportunity to validate our experiences in the context of a larger community, to connect personal pain to larger systemic issues, and to reframe some of that individual struggle as part of a shared experience. And that, in and of itself, can reduce some of the isolation and create a little bit more empowerment to take collective action toward healing. And so there's many layers to working with these patterns in our nervous system.
I was listening to Resma Minikin on a podcast recently, and he was talking about how sometimes white people can't understand how they may have been programmed. And I thought he gave a great example that on we were white people were programmed to see black people in a certain way. That's why they're play certain roles in movies, or you see them in certain types of commercials, or just on television, and just the way that we are, the way that we're all portrayed, right? To see yourself also portrayed in a way on television. You and I had a conversation on the relationship to our bodies, about going out and always being like, is that my body? Is that my body? Looking for our bodies in public, looking for our bodies on the television, looking for that way to be relatable. And I found that to just be such a powerful example that, like, oh, we got programmed to see people, other bodies that were different from us, different from us. And there is not much difference between us at all. And it's been such a deliberate act, this division that we find ourselves in. And what I have found through NSI in my own experience is that I'm able to hold bigger conversations. I'm able to hold these conversations that might have felt threatening for me in my body, that I can have these now. I can listen to that. I can listen to someone else's experience without that being a threat of, like, I've done something wrong, or my people did all these wrong things. Or does that make sense? I'm not saying that we didn't do things wrong at all. We did. We have done some bad things. And I can hold space for that person's experience in my body now and respond what I feel is more of what NSI has given me, to feel just more human
Yeah.
in my body. That, like, I've said this before, and I don't know, maybe this is like so cheesy or something, but like, our souls come here. Why is any soul, there's no hierarchy to the soul. That doesn't exist. We are souls in bodies, and no soul is better than me. And there's no soul out here that is a lesser of me either. And I really believe that. And NSI brought me to some of these really inherent divine truths that I can trust.
I'm going to share something that feels really vulnerable to share. And honestly, I have a little bit of a fear response about talking about some of this stuff on such a big platform. but we'll see how this goes. So I have also really seen the same thing and the reaction that occurs even in my own body, and why nervous system capacity is so important for having these bigger conversations. I have been doing some work with a consultant to work on NSI to make sure that we are really aligning with the values and the principles and the mission that we want to put out, which is also addressing systemic components to trauma, and doing some work on making sure that the curriculum is trauma informed at that level, and that we are including equity, justice, and liberation in that work. And some of those conversations, I found initially we would have conversations, we would go through the curriculum and see places where the blinders were on, right? Where there was not, there were things that I didn't see and didn't know and needed more education about. And initially, I found after the conversations, and I didn't understand at first what was happening, I would have a lot of brain fog. I would get really tired. I would start to have these thoughts in my mind of like, this is too big. I can't do this. I would want to just like turn off my computer and shut down and be like, it's just, I don't know. I don't know was the thing coming up. And I really recognized by looking at my body, my joints were swelling, my hands were puffy, uh, my eye was starting to give out a little bit, and I thought, I'm in a shame response. I'm in a big, deep shame response. And if I want to do this work and have these conversations, which I do, I want to learn because I feel like it's my liberation too. It's all, it's everything. It's the point of all of it. Then I have to really live this work in this context too, and keep creating capacity and allowing myself to feel those sensations. And some of it felt really big. It felt like big collective shame. And as I started to work through it and I was able to talk with her about that and just take it in minimum effective dose and remember that it was okay to make mistakes. That was part of the programming too. And just keep going. Like, just keep going, keep working with it, and know that it's not going to be perfect. And it's been a big eye-opening experience for me to see how much that lives in my own body and what is really required for me to be able to work through it and do the best that I can with it.
Yeah. Personal, and it's your dedication to this, right? But to yourself, like we were talking about, it's the personal nervous system regulation. Is the foundation for creating meaningful collective change. It's that daily practice that gets you in that chair in front of this person building this organization from a place you believe in for the world, actually. I think that's really beautiful, because if you were to come into that situation, or if anybody were to go into that situation in a chronic state of dysregulation and an activated F response, how are you going to engage in a meaningful conversation around change, around movement work like that? And it's this is the dysregulation that consumes the body's resources. It leaves little capacity for empathy, for collaboration, for problem solving. And so there's we need that. We need this nervous system regulation so that we can go into being able to have to receive the others experiences, their thoughts, their ideas, right? We want to be problem solvers, and we don't know it. We just want to be listeners to for conflict resolution. You need to listen.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's so the, the stuff runs deep. And I know a lot of us out here are working for collective change. And if we're driven by these patterns at that deep subconscious level, there's just a place for working through that and for the ability to process the emotions that come with it, right? I mean, we've talked so much, or I was going to say this season, every season, all the time, about the importance of emotional processing and emotional regulation. And that also has an individual and a collective component, right? Like as a society, if we are generally, by and large, emotionally underdeveloped, like we don't have an experience of being taught to feel our emotions, how to process them, then we are moving reflexively into maybe more conflict or more anger or more divisiveness, and trying to protect ourselves from the vulnerability of some of these big emotions, collective grief, collective loss, like all of it. I just think, I think, thank you guys. Thank you to the listeners for being on this journey with us and being willing to learn with us as we learn, and as our research and work deepens, to revisit these conversations and expand out from the individual to the collective and look at some more of the dualities and the nuances of some of these topics. And yeah, just thank you for being here, growing with us, learning with us. And I'm sure there'll be more updates to everything as the evolution continues.
Yes, thank you all so much for being with us.